It's easier, someone once said, to imagine the end of the world than it is the end of capitalism.
But it's clear that where we can make systems of this complexity, cultural systems, economic systems, machines of this complexity, surely we could make a world that could first meet those needs I described that everyone should have, and then perhaps meet needs that people have only dreamed of, like the need for some autonomy and freedom. The need for that little space up there, the I part, to expand a little bit. Just a little. Just a little. Just a little.
The socialism that could engage with the yearnings and dreamings
in Miles Davis music.
An aesthetic dimension.
Radically incompatible with everyday life under capitalism.
Hey there, all Acid Left podcast listeners. Welcome to another edition of the Acid Left podcast, and we are here with Conrad Hamilton, co-author of Myth and Mayhem, a leftist critique of Jordan Peterson, and What is PostModern Conservatism, both from Zero Books. Conrad is from Canada, yet resides in Paris, France, where he recently finished writing his PhD thesis entitled Marx Contra Subjectivity, under the supervision of Catherine Malabou at the University Paris VIII. His thesis relates to Marx and Speculative Realism. We'll be discussing this as well as issues of consent and left political tactics, so stay tuned. Okay, Conrad, so you run the Zero Books Capital Comrades reading group with Ernesto Vargas and Elliot Rosenstock, and you convene regularly to read Marx's Capital, I think volume 1 at the moment, yeah? Mm-hmm. And you also have this kind of very lively Facebook page, which has really interested me lately because you get these kind of quite kind of crazy tangents, but you still manage to kind of bring it back onto a kind of very directed conversation on Marx and some of the more complex points in Capital. So, I mean, we could describe you as part of the online left.
Sure, yeah.
I mean, how would you describe your approach to your reading group and your feelings about the online left today and its kind of efficacy?
I think, I mean, it seems to me that, you know, when it comes to trying to advance left-wing politics, that one difficulty you can often come up against is that, you know, on one hand, you know, to achieve change, it often seems like it's necessary to, you know, construct or contribute to sort of mass movements. But on the other, you know, if you're in a climate that's very, very defined by, let's say, neoliberal ideology, you know, there has to be a certain obstinance regarding what you believe, right? If you're a Marxist, because it's you know, if you don't have the resources there amongst the public, right, to build the sort of movement you want, then the question becomes, well, how do you pursue that, right? And I think in many cases that requires certain forms of education. I guess the approach I take to it is that, you know, in the English-speaking world, we've seen this tremendous upsurge of left-wing politics in a way, right? You know, talking about Sanders, you know, the DSA, Jacobin, and so forth. And I think, you know, there was a bit of a notion, like, you know, in these sort of organizations that that maybe was a little bit naive that you know, a relatively left-wing candidate like Sanders could succeed just by sort of being parachuted into the Democratic field, and then you know, by sort of persuading disaffected liberals that, you know, that we're not so different than you, that, you know, this is just a slightly more muscular version of what the liberalism of the Democratic Party is already calling for, so you should vote for us. I think the limitations of that strategy were very clearly displayed, right, in the Democratic primary, in terms of, you know, seeing the tremendous efforts that were undertaken to marginalize Sanders as a candidate. I mean, no one in the history of the modern history of the Democratic primary has dropped out, you know, prior to Super Tuesday when they were doing as well as Pete Buttigieg did. So I think what this tells us is that, you know, we're not going to be successful unless we're actually able to, at an electoral level, for example, unless we're actually able to sort of reshape the terrain of social struggle and social advocacy. So, where I see the group that I'm running sort of intervening in that is that I see it as existing within this context of mass struggle, but as trying to advocate for a more singular line and a more stubborn line when it comes to the significance of class struggle. So again, I think a lot, in that respect, a lot of what I've been trying to do is just to cultivate a balance whereby, I don't want us to become a sort of factionalist cult. I want us to have a very, very broad dialogue, with other segments of sort of the, whatever you want to call it, alt-left, dirtbag left, DSA left, whatever. But at the same time, I want it to be a place where, we're able to critique liberal ideology and engage in a serious way with communist thought, and Marx being very central in that respect, in a manner that's uncompromising. So, that's a tough balance to achieve. And one thing I've really been focused on, has been, I think, a couple things. I would say two things that have really, been personally important to me. One of them is, there's a lot of, sort of very young, I think, people, a lot of them like Gen Z, who are quite disaffected by the current economic conditions in the English world. And often they latch on to these sort of extreme, like everything Stalin did was great sort of positions, right? It's like, it's sort of the bad infinity, they just take to the opposite extreme of what they're seeing in society or what they imagine to be the opposite extreme. And without, telling those people they're wrong, part of what I've been trying to do, I think, is work with young people and try to encourage them to take on maybe a more intellectually robust and balanced approach to Marxism as a social movement and as a history. And another thing that's been very important to me has been trying to disseminate knowledge and hold discussions about, what's going on in China, for better and for worse. And with the goal of helping to dissuade the current sort of propaganda and I think sort of mobilization to go to war that you see now in our culture. So that's sort of been my focus, if that helps.
For sure, yeah. I mean, that's definitely interesting and kind of what I was looking for in the sense that you've identified kind of tanky element, an element of, I guess, edgelords, left edgelords who embrace Stalinism, the imagery, or just the fact of the gulags, and you said that you talk about that with people if people are engaging in that kind of rhetoric, and you kind of, I guess, you take it seriously. I mean, I've seen you on the forum on your Facebook page, maybe giving some credibility to that, but saying putting in a historical context. I kind of worry a little bit about the online left, about the extremism of young people, the ease at which they dismiss anything but extremism as being like neoliberalism, or someone being a libtard, or whatever the term, whatever term they're going to use, if they don't outright support a revolution. And of course, I think anybody who, maybe it's an age thing partly, because when you're young, you're all about that. You just have the energy. You're like, let's just try it. Let's just do it. And if you're a bit older, then you're quite aware of the impossibility of armed insurrection against the US state or British state or Canadian, whatever, any Western state, given the armaments they have. So yeah, I kind of think, how does one kind of address that? And dialogue is a great thing, and getting people to read is a great thing. Another thing that kind of interests me is, how does one make this kind of thing concrete? How does one make it do something politically? And that's maybe another question. Because, this being on the internet, I worry that it's just a great way of stopping people from actually engaging in any kind of real political sense. So, I mean, how would you kind of try and go about that, of getting people actually doing stuff that changes stuff?
Sure. Well, I think with respect to your question, sorry, I'm just going to turn off the sound from my browser. Open volume mixer. Okay, just to turn off the sound on Chrome. There we go. I think with respect to your questions, the first thing is that I think often there's a real failure, maybe. Because obviously, like if we just say, well, like everything Stalin did was great or something, this is problematic, to put it mildly. I think sometimes, when it comes to left-wing history, though, there's a bit of because, I think in Western societies, we've been raised in a context where, certain forms of political liberties are afforded. And that also has to do with the high developmental state of these countries. But if you look at the way that America or France had their revolutions, for example, the way in which they constituted this sort of Republican basis that could eventually serve as a springboard toward the creation of a greater democracy, it was always violent, right? The first act in the American Revolution was, do you agree with us or do you not? If you don't, get the fuck out, right? Similarly, were it not for, Robespierre and the Reign of Terror, it's very possible the French Republic wouldn't exist today. And these were very, very decisive models in terms of the formation of republics and democratic states in the context of modern Europe. I think sometimes what we fail to recognize is that a lot of countries, right, that were significantly less developed or colonized, they went through this process of republican consolidation a lot later, right? So if you look at, France at the time of the French Revolution, only 25% of people spoke French. Well, how did they make French a general language, right? I mean, they didn't go hold plebiscites everywhere. I mean, this was imposed, right? And that, for better or for worse, that's sort of a condition of having a modern economy, right? Like you have to have forms of labor mobility, you have to have a common language, you have to have certain forms of systems of transit communication that function. So I think, again, if you look at places like the Soviet Union or places like China, without excusing, a lot of excesses, I think one has to also understand this is symptomatic of just sort of the sheer agony and difficulty of establishing those conditions in environments where they haven't previously existed. And I guess the point that I would make about that is that, democratization isn't just a question of, the will of political leadership. It's a question of time and change. And, for instance, like how can you meaningfully have an active polis, an active political society that votes and contributes in some way towards the formation of a democratic consensus if you have no literacy, no education, right? And that's just a very, very obvious example. So as regards these kind of assessments, I mean, I don't think the solution is to say, well, okay, like Stalin's good, Mao's good or something. I don't think that those sort of simplistic assessments will ever do justice to the complexity of these historical figures. But I do think what the solution is actually honestly trying to situate these people in their historical context, rather than simply holding them or comparing them to the sort of benchmarks of sort of human rights and dignity that we've established, in the contemporary capitalist economies of the West. The wealth of those countries, of course, being, let's not kid ourselves, predicated on historical forms of exploitation and colonialism. It's a very, very complex subject. But to answer, that sort of answer your question about how I try to deal with that in a what I would see as a balanced way.
Conrad, what you just said kind of made me think of some of Zizek's writings about like revolutionary terror, like I don't know, in the mid 2000s era, where he kind of puts forward this idea that like the reversal of the common sense saying, and he says, if we're going to be cracking some eggs, we better make sure we're making an omelet. So I think the question there really does go back to like in a contemporary setting. It's much harder to think about than the historical settings. How do we make sure that we're making an egg or making an omelet if these eggs are going to be cracked? If revolutionary terror may exist, what's the point that we really have the ability to make the omelet, to make the better society? Or where do you say, no, you've just been beating eggs?
I think that's a bizarre kind of analogy because it's like, well, of course you need to break eggs to make an omelette, but that doesn't in any case mean you need to kill people to make a communist state. They're not equal things. You know, I mean, they're not. I mean, you could say, well, you have to break an egg to make an omelette. So if you want to play American football, you have to break some heads. You know what I mean? It's like you don't necessarily have to break some heads. You know, it doesn't really necessarily follow. But I'd say another thing. Sorry to interrupt there, but just because it was on my mind, is that you're describing the formation of democratic states happening through violence. Yeah, but you're also describing the formation of states as such. No? France, Italy, they were both formed through violence. Then you name one that wasn't. So you're saying to amass a lot of power in the hands of one person, significant power over a large territory in the hands of one person, you need to impose their will, basically. And
not necessarily one person.
Yeah. Oh yeah, okay. But that's one person. But I mean, you know, a class or a group of people with a vision. That, you know, that you need to impose an education system. You need to get people thinking in the right way. So an education system, okay, it's a way of educating people in the values of a revolution, but it may be the way of educating people in the values of industrial capital as well, for example. In actual fact, if you look at all the education systems as they arose as compulsory, it coincided with the rise of industrialization. So do we really have an example where the formation of the state is necessary to communism, or is it rather necessary to industrial evolution, or simply to state building when there are actually other options that don't involve states? And that's the real option we're losing now, not left versus right. We still have left and right clearly very much in play. We have welfare systems in, I imagine, I wouldn't say all countries. I mean, do we have welfare systems in all countries? At least all Western countries. There's a left element. The thing we don't have is an anarchist element, and that would be like something I would throw in there just to be kind of devil's advocate, because I don't think you're going to go for that, because I think you're very much on the statist side.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I won't, but I will say some things that I think are important about that as well. You know, the thing is, I'm not even. It's interesting to talk about to discuss statism, because, you know, when I think about these things, it seems to me that the kind of forms of governance that could emerge, right, you know, in the context of attempting to cultivate something like a communism would be greatly variable, right? You know, it would depend on the general conditions of the society. So, you know, you're correct totally. I think that, you know, if you're in an industrial era, right, and you're trying to create, you know, a sort of functional state, you know, that it will be necessary in a lot of respects to implement certain protocols of industrialization. You know, and we can go look at Marx and the way that he sees communism as sort of arising from, you know, the elevation of productivity as well. But I also think that, you know, when you talk about anarchism, so I'm very Hegelian in the sense that, you know, I don't see us as being able to step immediately outside of the current dispensation. I mean, in Marx, indebted as he is to Hegel, we see a lot of like sort of obstetric kind of metaphors, right? You know, a new society is being born, and there's phases to that. But I do think, as regards the question of anarchism, it's interesting because it seems to me that today we have like a way, you know, in many ways we have such a diverse communications apparatus compared to what you had, you know, in the past, where you had, you know, centralized factories and, you know, maybe few TV channels, you know, radio stations or whatever. You know, and this is actually the nature of what we're discussing when we're talking about Facebook groups and things like this. So what I would tend to think is that, you know, for a successful kind of communism to be created today, that it would have to, that it couldn't just ape the character of sort of, you know, I'm talking about the West, right? These areas where this communications apparatus has become extremely diverse, especially. It couldn't just ape sort of the industrial models of the past, that would actually have to do things in a different way. And, you know, I think we can go back and talk about like Allende in Chile, like experimenting with computational approaches to communism. Nick Cernicek talks about this, like Cybersyn. You know, I mean, I do think that without dismissing the ongoing importance of industry, especially in places like China that are still sort of in an industrial stage, that if we're talking about the West, we have to be talking about the ways that computation, for example, could facilitate not just a desirable level of individual expression and decentralization, but could also help organize, a sort of communist economy appropriate to our current economic era.
So yeah, on that, I think it goes back to what I was saying in a way, because it's that these compositional technologies are being introduced in the West, and they are causing violence. Disrupting the job markets, disrupting production and the way we go about it. So I think, Zizek's point there is precisely not that you have to break eggs in order to make an omelet. It's that eggs are being broken. That, you can use that, such as Allende sought to do in Chile, to harness some of those disruptive technologies for the better. And that's definitely worth experimenting with.
Yeah. Sorry, continue. Mike, go ahead.
Well, yeah, I mean, there is a certain aspect of realism, and I suppose if eggs are being broken, then break them, for the omelette, not, just to have broken eggs, that get wasted. So I can go along with that. But I think we'll move on to something a little bit different, or hopefully we can still talk about these kind of practical considerations. But I wanted to ask Conrad about his PhD thesis, not specifically the thesis as such, but the kind of general topic. I understand you wrote your thesis on Marx and Speculative Realism, and it's called Marx Contra Subjectivity. So basically, for those unfamiliar with the term speculative realism, or who just want to recap, it's a movement that began, I believe, like the first use of the term was around 2008. There was a conference in
2007, yeah.
College,
April
2007. Okay, very good. April 2007, there was a conference, kind of small seminar, I believe. There was Ray Brassier was there. Quentin Myasou, was Graham Harman there? Ian Hamilton Grant?
Yeah, and Alberto Toscano moderating, yeah.
Okay, yeah. And this term kind of came out of them talking from their kind of broadly materialist positions, whereby they kind of took umbrage at what's called the Copernican turn of Kant. Well, I think it's probably better called the Kantian turn. But basically the point in which Kant said that, we can only really know the limits of the human mind. So trying to kind of like streamline philosophy, take it away from kind of this kind of quasi-religious mythic thinking to kind of simplify things. He basically said that philosophy needs to concentrate merely on what we can know about the limits of thought itself. So we can no longer inquire into the nature of objects, the existence of God, and so on. So this is kind of very well intentioned, but kind of ended up in a kind of weird situation in philosophers trying to kind of cede their power, saying, we're not kind of all-seeing kind of philosopher kings over the universe. We can't kind of decide what reality is. Ended up that the kind of realm of philosophy became so narrow that there was kind of exactly the opposite of what they intended to happen. That you end up with this kind of very insular realm of quasi kind of poesis, quasi poetry, where anything that could be known could only be known by the philosopher, kind of thing. So to kind of invert that, Brassier, Myasou, and so on, basically said, actually we can inquire into the object. Not only can we inquire into the object, we have to admit that we are objects. We are not privileged kind of overseers as subjects. The subject is an object. Okay, so kind of very important inversion, which I found very interesting. Actually wrote my PhD partly on, because I kind of felt that challenged somehow ethics as such, that if we're all objects, where do we kind of port the ethics back in? Although I think Brassier actually taught me on my master's, and I did used to email him a bit whilst I was writing my thesis. People like Brassier actually found this kind of quite funny, this kind of notion. Generally, people were saying that, this is an abomination because there can be no ethic without subjectivity, or rather, if the subject is construed as an object. And to that, someone like Brassier would say, that's just you speaking. It's not like the minute I decide that I'm no longer a privileged subject, I start suddenly walking around killing people. You know, it doesn't necessarily follow. But it kind of ties in with the kind of idea that there's no intrinsic meaning if we're just objects. That also, it kind of gets discounted in Ray Brassier's book, Nihil Unbound, that in a sense, there is no God-given or overarching meaning, but meaning still exists as a kind of compartment of human thinking, which is something that is materialistic, but still nonetheless exists. So, I mean, that's kind of speculative realism. I mean, there are interesting aspects because actually none of them really use the term anymore. And Brassier from the beginning was very kind of anti the term. Myasou preferred speculative materialism. Harman went off and started this object-oriented philosophy, which splintered into object-oriented ontology with Levi Bryant. So the term was kind of short-lived, but it still kind of suffices to describe a very broad movement. But I mean, my question really is, I think it's enough of a question in itself. How does one fit Marxism into this, Conrad?
Yeah, thanks for asking, Mike. I think one thing I see about speculative realism is it's mostly an attempt to rehabilitate different forms of ontological materialism, right? So you have to differentiate between the sort of approach that Marx adopted, right? Really from the German ideology onward, right? Trying to describe history in terms of class struggle, means of production, relations of production, modes of production, and so on. The sort of abstract conceptualization of reality as being defined by matter, right? So there's a difference there because Marx's materialism is sort of a materialism of practice, right? Rather than just rather than a more abstract ontological approach. So I think, what I see about speculative realism in the conference of 2007, which had such a big impact on philosophy, really. I mean, I'm in Western Europe, maybe it was greater here, but I think widely. One thing I see about it is that, first of all, I want to kind of situate it in its economic context, right? So this was happening 2007, 2008, just as the global recession was kind of breaking out. And, the claim sort of being made by these philosophers collectively was, there's an idealism that's latent in the Kantian perspective, and, a kind of resignation, right, where we can't really access or understand reality. And I think if you want to really understand that, I think what you kind of have to understand, I mean, Frederick Jameson in postmodernism, or the cultural logic of late capitalism, he says that alienation is a modernist experience because alienation presupposes a reference point that's outside of sort of our capitalist world that you can latch onto, right? There's this sort of romantic pastoral forest that's out here that is not subsumed by capital. And I think, one thing Jameson discusses is how, in a way, in the context of postmodernism, one becomes so sort of totally alienated, as you will, that they're even able to experience it as a kind of vertigo of enjoyment, right? And you see this in a certain sense in Deleuze, right, when he talks about sort of accelerate the processes, right? This idea that maybe we can't or shouldn't look to some kind of originary site of meaning, right? So I see the problem being confronted by speculative realism as being a problem quite particular to late capitalism and postmodern life, right? Which is that, again, in a world that's totally sort of subsumed by capital, where and constantly changing as a consequence of that, like what Marx says, all that's solid melts into air. How do you find a sort of nucleus or basis of resistance? And this is actually, this is a problem in a way in Marx's work, right? Traditionally, when people read Marx, they've tended to sort of take labor, right, as being, the means through which we can resist capital. And while that might have some provisional truth, the problem with this, of course, is that, the constitution of a labor force within capitalist economies is itself a sort of historically specific development. What I try to look to, what I try to get to in my thesis is I'm trying to answer the question of, what does subjectivity mean for Marx, and where is it from? And at one point in Marx's work, I actually just found this out today. At one point in Marx's work, he says, you know, an individual is not something that can just be historically presupposed. It's something that's developed through a process. Similarly, in the first chapter of Capital, Marx says that, you know, you couldn't have the recognition that labor is the basis of value, you know, or we should say that the notion that labor is the basis of value is co-constituted along with the notion of human equality or humanism, right? So in other words, it's the equivocation of the value of the labor of different workers that supplies us with the idea that, you know, there's this sort of notion of the universal human, right? You know, certainly if we talk about, you know, in the time of the ancient Greeks, they didn't seem to really be endowed with this kind of idea. So what I try to do, you know, there's a thinker named Alfred Sohn-Rethel, and he's very interesting. He wrote a book called Intellectual and Manual Labor, and what he basically argues in the book is that the capacity to think in an abstract way, and he means something specific here. He means to think that the world is governed by a kind of uniform genus, right? Like the first, like the Greek thinkers in Miletus, right? Sort of pre-Platonic, you know, people like Thales, you know, the whole world's fire, the whole world's water. You know, then kind of running through to Plato's forms, to the notion of the monotheistic God. What Sohn-Rethel argues is that the basis of this kind of abstract thinking, right? You know, the sort of thinking of substance in this way is actually linked to the development of, you know, currency in ancient Greece. So I suppose around the same time in ancient Greece, in Miletus actually, you had the earliest developments of this kind of philosophical thinking of the arca or substratum that went hand in hand with the diffusion of currency. And for him, as commodity exchange becomes more diffused historically, and as it imputes its character to labor, this, you know, to make a long story short, because he goes through different historical eras, but sort of the climax of this is kind of the age of modernity. And for him, in a way, if you look at someone like Kant, what Sohn-Rethel's arguing is sort of the way we think is not, it's shaped by commodity exchange in a lot of ways. So for him, the primacy of efficient causality comes from the exchange of commodities, for example. You know, he supplies all different kinds of examples of this in his text. But what he argues is that if you look at sort of the non-deductive mathematical approaches used for, you know, sort of the terrestrial physics of, you know, of I forget, sorry, or if you look at the non-deductive character of physical developments, right, like things you see like Galileo and Newton and so forth. Kant was trying to figure out how these people could think, how they could use these non-deductive models, right, to make these breakthroughs in the sciences. And Kant couldn't see where in concrete reality, right, that these people were able to derive these ideas from, right? And this created a problem for the sort of empiricistic philosophy like Hume that Kant was very interested by, because of course we know that, you know, in empiricism, there's sort of a certain notion of the derivation of impressions from physical reality, right? So what Kant decided was that sort of to solve this problem of the sort of non-deductive character of the maths and sciences, the best solution was to make the argument that these things reside within our sort of a priori, right? That, you know, as subjects that we are innately bestowed with the capacity to think these things, and that they frame our entire sort of empirical experience. But so what Sohn-Rethel argues is actually that these things don't come from the abstract subject, that they actually come from, again, the historical structure of commodity exchange that kind of governs our metaphysics. So what I argue in the thesis, essentially, and I go through all these things, but what I argue essentially is that there are dualism, right? For me, is sort of rooted in the division between exchange value and use value, right? The usability of a commodity versus the value that it commands in the market, which is connected with the development of economies. But what I argue is that, you know, throughout much of Western history, you've had these sort of metaphysical notions that have taken hold as a consequence of the expansion of commodity production. And I just mentioned dualism, the notion of sort of an abstract subject, notions of substance and all of this. And what I argue is that, in a way, just as capital is beginning to contradict itself, so too can we begin to see the sort of fragilities or cracks in this kind of edifice, right? So Marx certainly identified Darwin as representing a certain kind of rupture that way, in the sense that Darwin, in a way, went beyond traditional metaphysical notions of subjectivity to show that, this notion of a fundamental division between, man as being allotted some kind of divine capacity and external nature wasn't really tenable in that sense. Similarly, if you look to certain developments in physics, right? If you look at thermodynamics and entropy, which really complicates processes of capitalist accumulation, especially if we're talking about climate change and things like that. If we look at the way that quantum physics goes beyond models of abstract physics, which are also very important to classical political economy, like Adam Smith, we can see that in our world, not only do we have economic contradictions that are faced by capitalism, but we also have contradictions in our general knowledge or in our sciences that are surfacing. So for me, what speculative realism actually shows is, look at our situation today, right? We are beginning to realize that nature is not just a kind of externality that can be, freely exploited for economic purposes, right? We have automation that's really challenging, the notion that thinking is the privileged domain of humans. And we could go on. There's a lot of these things. But where I see speculative realism as emerging is in a certain economic conjuncture where it's become very, very possible, I think, to challenge a lot of these traditional dogmas of Western philosophy that insist upon, again, abstract notions of substance, dualism, and so forth. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to explain the way that speculative realism is correct, but not for the reasons that it thinks it's correct, right? It's sort of correct dialectically, right? Unable to identify its own correctness because it reflects these larger truths that have to be situated within the context and structure of economic history.
Are you, in that case, allowing for the re-entry of a subject? What is the status in that case of the subject for you? Because that's maybe something I didn't really grasp. Because what I would say is that, look, if everything is objective, then if you have contrary political forces, you basically have right-wing objects versus left-wing objects. You see what I mean? Or you have the policeman object versus the protester object. Where's the subjectivity coming in? I suppose this is what Marx was trying to do. But then it's almost like Marx is saying there's a subjectivity that's been lost, and he's trying to reinstitute it. Where are you standing on this? Are you saying that somehow subjectivity can be created, or it can be feigned, or what status does the subject have in a realm where we know ourselves to be objects?
Well, I think that the language of subject is very loaded in a way that I think would, for me anyway, make it hard to apply to a conception of what reality might entail, right, beyond the sort of obfuscations and ideologies that we're exposed to. But I do think that one thing we find in Marx is that, so there's a lot of confusion about Marx, because when Marx starts out, he sort of goes in the direction of Feuerbach, right? And Feuerbach interpreted Hegel's dialectic in a way where the truth of dialectic is sort of the biological subject, right? So, if Hegel talks about religion, what is really being articulated here are the kind of inner spiritual needs of the human. So early on, when Marx was talking, when he uses these terms like alienation, he has this idea, right, of a sort of biologically grounded subject, and capital is doing things which don't comport with its interests, or cause that kind of dispossessing effect. But the thing is, then Marx reads Stirner, right, The Ego in Its Own, and Stirner basically critiques Feuerbach, and Stirner says, well, look, Feuerbach's, transcendentally biological subject is really just, like a bourgeois religious German or whatever, and there's not what this doesn't, this just sort of universalizes or biologizes that idea. And so Marx, himself in the German ideology, he critiques Feuerbach and says, well, wherever Feuerbach looks for nature, what he really sees is industry and commerce. So this starts a process whereby Marx no longer really takes the subject as the basis of his analysis. Instead, he starts to turn to, again, I said relations of production, modes of production, social formations, and so on. And he tries to analyze history in a different way. And within that context, he sees the modern notion of subjectivity as being developed as a consequence of market relations. Now, I will say, I want to add to this, this doesn't mean that Marx doesn't think there's like a notion of the human that can perhaps be retrieved from all this. But I think Marx is very, very reticent to lay it out in clear terms, because I think what I understand his latter-day work is suggesting is that we're so deeply enmeshed kind of in the matrix of capitalism, of commodity production and so on, that were we to try to just isolate a certain definition of what the biological human is, and to draw normative conclusions from it, we would end up just sort of reprising, the historically specific aspects of our era, or the sort of metaphysical notions of our era. So again, I don't preclude it. I think the human is a thing, but I think the thing is, how do you separate, if possible, the notion or the biological character of the human, the natural character of the human? How can you attach that or separate it? Sorry, how can you separate that from all the kind of collective baggage that we've assigned to it? And that's a very, very hard question, right?
Yeah, I don't. I don't know that you can, but I suppose there's ways of it's a bit like, how can one have freedom? If we're all commodified, how can one have freedom online? But then you're always finding something coming up through the cracks that somehow, it's all to use perhaps the wrong phrase, it's highly subjective. Subjectivity is highly subjective, but it's, what's a better phrase to use? It's highly relative. I mean, there's still huge amounts of, there's still huge maneuver for freedom using Facebook today. There's so many things you could or could not do. You're choosing one thing. Of course, this will get into more kind of meta issues of what is freedom, what is freedom, what is freedom, what is free will, etc. But what I mean is that there's always going to be something that we think is a free choice, something that we think is us acting with agency as a subject. So ultimately that is what subjectivity is. It's thinking I'm making a choice. So I think that there's always going to be a case for having a subject, and it's always going to be possible. But then you get into kind of wider issues of, is that enough? Is it enough to settle for what a subject constitutes within this particular historical moment relative to otherwise complete unfreedom or objectivity? So it's kind of it's a very complex issue, really. I mean, I would say that, and what I've argued actually in the first book I did with Zero Books was called Towards a Conceptual Militancy, is that we have to assume that we're not free, but then fight for a freedom anyway. So in that, in these terms, assume that we're objects, but then declare our subjectivity in any case, which is something that we can always do because the human mind allows for that. And that's something that you get through art. This is almost an artistic gesture that you can say, okay, well, this is a canvas. These are some paints made of oil and pigment, but I'm going to make it into a landscape. There you go. Here's a landscape. And it's not really a contradiction. You are never at any point saying this is actually some trees and a river and some hills and whatever. It's a bit like that with subjectivity, that we can say, well, okay, yeah, we're objects, but you always then have the choice of saying, I declare myself as a free subject in any case. So, even within an absolutely null, objective reality, we're always going to have the recourse to come back and claim some kind of freedom, which I think we have to do. Otherwise, you're just giving up. So, I think we can't say we're free in the first instance, because then you're always at risk that you've actually been duped and that you just think you're free. So I think we have to come from the angle that, okay, we are objects in an objectified society. and then try and claw back your subjectivity in the knowledge that any kind of subjectivity you declare is going to be happening on account of the material conditions of your thinking in any case, even disregarding the material conditions of society, of the economy. Our brains and neurons are material. But, we are the only thing, to our knowledge, that can countenance all of that. Like, we're aware of all of that, and then still kind of, in any case, invent some kind of like free will. So I think it's like worth doing, because why wouldn't we do it?
Yeah, well, I agree with you. I guess I just want to kind of like, and this will get us into sort of quite semantic philosophical territory maybe, but I just want to, I want to say that I see there as being two ways to approach this kind of question. So I think one way would be as Zizek sort of approaches it, which is to posit there as being like kind of ontological negativity or gap within the structure of reality, right? So to say that, free choice in a way will always exist because there will always be something that breaks down, right? There's always something about reality, sort of an ontologization of Lacan. There's always something about reality that won't function systemically, like a kind of contingency, right? So you can even take this in science, like you can look at Stephen Jay Gould and say, well, evolution is contingent or whatever. There's another way of approaching this, which I actually prefer, which is more of a Spinozist way. And that is to say that, well, if that like there's no freedom in the universe, right? Structurally. But there is a lack of capacity to discern how the universe functions, right? And so this is sort of how I see it. I don't see there as being any limit, any theoretical, I say deliberately, theoretical limit to knowledge or any kind of gap or innate contingency to things. But I do see freedom as emerging, or what I think you're referring to as freedom here, necessarily because of an incapacity to actually understand all of the structures that kind of flow into us or define us, right? And so I think, like obviously if you're, I think everyone's had this experience, like, if you don't know how to use a computer program, for example, you end up kind of clicking everywhere and sort of experimenting and seeing what's going to work, right? And I guess I see it as being, not an ontological freedom in that way, but a limitation to knowledge, right? As being what kind of drives and bestows us with, the capacity the closest thing I would describe as the capacity to act freely.
Okay, well, with that, I think we're going to move into something a little bit different. Adam, did you want to come in with some of your questions?
Yeah, I was just curious about some of Conrad's work around like neo-masculinity. I know you wrote about that in the What is Postmodernism, or what is conservative postmodernism?
Postmodern conservatism, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, with Matt McManus. Yeah. And that's something that I've found pretty interesting, the rise of this, along with like fears of feminization, the red pill community, the pickup artist, you have the incels are also, part of that whole group. But in the late 80s and early 90s, you also saw people use the term neo-masculinity, but it tended to refer to like this idea of men embracing like emotion, embracing complexity, kind of rejecting traditional masculinity. And I was wondering if you knew anything about that and about the shift from that, trying to get away from like what might now be called toxic masculinity into a more robust masculine subject versus like this reassertion of hyper traditional machismo.
Sure. Yeah, well, I have an essay in that book, which I'm proud of. And that all came to me very, very fast. I was in Tübingen in Germany, and I wrote that. What the argument that I basically make in that is that, in a way, it's interesting, like if you look at, and you can even trace kind of like the earliest maybe notions of neo-masculinity back to, sort of feminist or sort of male receptions to feminism, right? And I think there's a progressive process of radicalization. And I think part of that has to do with the fact that I think now more and more you're seeing, I think traditionally there was this sort of notion that equality and rights could be achieved, if we just give women 1% more rights per year or something in this kind of liberal reformist way, that eventually things will snowball and we'll have equality. But I think what we're seeing now is that faced with the long-term possibility, let's say, of, at least in certain Western countries, of a more meaningful form of equality being created, that what you're beginning to see is a sort of increasing tension about that, right? And this probably puts the lie to the notion that it was ever kind of tidily or consensually achievable, right? The notion of gender equality. So in terms of neo-masculinist sort of movements, I actually think there's a few different points we can identify as significant. I mean, in the 70s and stuff, when you talk about some of the precursors to this emerging, you're even talking, I think, about maybe the 90s. There was, in many respects, an approach taken that was more conciliatory to the goals of feminism, or more in agreement to it. But then I think you have to look at sort of the subjects of this discourse. So I think as you see deindustrialization occurring, I think you find that there are more and more men in North America, for example, who feel this sense of disorientation in terms of the state of the economy and where it's at, unable to devise maybe a more exacting analysis of how these factors have developed that negatively affect them. There's a strong tendency to kind of blame it on women. So again, after the sort of factory closures and this sort of shift and the great inroads made by women in fields such as post-secondary education, you begin to see pickup artist communities developing that are that have quite a strong misogynist bent. And even you see this in Neil Strauss, right? The Game, which I think he was a Rolling Stone journalist when he documents his time in sort of pickup circles. But then I think there's another shift that happens, which is around 2007, 2008. And I think especially because, male workers were really disproportionately affected, right, by the job losses in 2007, 2008. And economic anxieties in general were greatly increased. So I think after that period, you actually have a shift whereby originally these people were kind of, in a way, even if they stopped, putting forth objectives that were sort of correspondent with feminism, they were still responding to feminism in a sense, because it was kind of the emancipation of women and the emancipation of female desire that they were trying to game in a way, right? This idea that, if you present yourself as sort of this attractive caricature, then you'll be able to sleep with women well above your social station, right? So a lot of men, I think, who didn't have a lot going for them in their lives, maybe they became lured into this. But I think after 2007, 2008, that discourse actually becomes very explicitly political, right? So it's not just about trying to sleep with as many women as possible or trying to sleep with the most attractive women possible. It's like, well, that's not going to change, our unfavorable as it goes, because all these people are victims of horrendous persecution by women. That's not going to change our unfavorable dispensation. So we actually have to do politics, right? And then, I think what you see is this drift. Like you have, people like Rouge V or blogs like Chateau Artiste. And from 2007, 2008 onward, they start getting more and more political, more and more talking about what's going on in America. You see like bizarre articles on the Iliad and the what it can tell us about neo-masculinity and this kind of thing. It really gets off the subject of picking people up. And then I think, Trump really becomes important to this. Because Trump is so removed from kind of the dictates of political correctness. And in a way, he's like, of course, he's sort of famed for kind of his chauvinistic behavior with women, if not sexual assault, as the case may be. But also, I think what's really important about Trump is that in a way, he's like a winner and a loser at the same time, right? So he's successful enough to sort of be like an ego ideal in some way for these people. But also Trump, there was a sense in which he was always bitter about being sort of excluded from the, most culturally prestigious segments of the bourgeois, right? And this came out, right, in terms of his kind of animosity towards Obama. So I think and then of course a lot of these people get very, very involved, in promoting the Trump campaign, and it becomes especially significant because of, look, and I don't want to sit here and valorize Hillary Clinton or anything, but it becomes especially important because symbolically there was this possibility of a female president being elected for the first time. So yeah, does that help to explain a little bit what I see as the kind of political trajectory that unfolds in that way?
Absolutely. I see the trajectory there clear. It's an interesting movement, and I have to say we're having this conversation during No September, so takes on maybe even more of a meaning. And I think, also with its politicalization, you saw a lot of this being tied, like I said before, like this idea of feminization of men. And often the people that will speak about that, that are really concerned in a negative sense about like trans rights or something like that, they tie it to this idea of cultural Marxism, or as Petserson would say, postmodern Neo-Marxism. So could you expand a little bit on the connection there between that fear of a liberated feminine sexuality and like the fear of, the Marxists coming and destroying society as such?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I want to say about this, and I'll get, I think, more into the stuff on cultural Marxism in a second, but the first thing I want to say about this is that, of course, this is like a kind of, in the context of patriarchal societies, this claim of feminization is age old, right? We can go read like Joseph Addison's Cato or all kinds of texts. I think the best treatment of this that I'm aware of is actually Machiavelli, one of my favorite authors, who in The Prince, he says, he basically says, well, if you compare the average, Italian, and invariably he means men, if you compare the average Italian to the average Frenchman, the Frenchman would be really, really pathetic and mediocre by comparison. But he says that, this doesn't change the fact that they win wars against us every fucking time, right? And you see what he's doing there, right? It's sort of a parody of like the culture of like the patriarchal strongman, right? I'm sure if you went to places like Afghanistan, you'd find, of course, there's like a sort of class of strongmen who've been very hardened by the kind of conditions that prevail in those environments. But of course, these countries that are in which we could deign, the men in them to be relatively effete by comparison, we'll beat them in military confrontations every time. And this is because, the real strength isn't having kind of strong men, right? It's having a society that a real republic that's deeply civically integrated, in which everyone feels enfranchised and contributes to its productivity and success. So without valorizing too much, Western states, which obviously have a very dubious colonial legacy, I just want to say that, the real path to power, as a collective, as a society, may, likely paradoxically requires to a certain extent the kind of feminization of men insofar as it would be a real society, not one that's sort of presided over by a handful of kind of chieftains or whatever. So that would be just a response to that. But
absolutely.
Yeah. As with respect to, and it's funny, right? Because like, of course, people in neo-masculinist circles, they often like, it's very interesting, right? They're like, yeah, Russians are so tough compared to Americans. And it's like, well, I kind of lost the Cold War, right? Like, so, interesting. But I just want to say about the issue of cultural Marxism. I write about this in the book that I co-wrote with Matthew McManus, Ben Burgess, and Marion Trejo about Jordan Peterson, Myth and Mayhem, a leftist critique of Jordan Peterson. So about this idea, which Jordan Peterson, I think most famously talks about, of postmodern neo-Marxism or cultural Marxism. And we could delve into the history of that, certain dubious deployments of similar notions, in places like Nazi Germany. But in terms of the context of this term, I think it's interesting because what I feel is that Peterson has his own sort of genealogy of how this happens. So for him, basically you have this generation of French intellectuals like Derrida and Foucault and so forth. And again, Peterson's presentation of this is quite slovenly. But you have this generation of you have this generation of French intellectuals like Derrida and Foucault and so forth. And they sort of discover the terrors of Stalin and the gulags and so forth, so that then they attempt to sort of reprise Marxist thought, but just to sort of substitute out certain terms and ideas. So everything becomes about, sort of, power, or, a question of sort of deeply vested metaphysical structures, or this kind of thing. And it's interesting because, like, there's some truth in Peterson's narrative, isn't there? There were people like Foucault who had a certain hostility towards communism because of some of the revelations that came out with, certainly Khrushchev's critique of Stalin and sort of the celebritization of Solzhenitsyn and all of this. But I want to talk about kind of the function this serves, because it seems to me that, again, far from simply representing an attempt to, reprise a lot of Marxist ideas whilst merely kind of changing the nominal designation. Post-structuralism was part of, a big sort of liberal turn in our culture that did see, the tremendous weakening. Certainly, I think of Marxism as a social force, of, parties that were very, very organized, like, the Italian and French communist parties. Again, there's no monocausal thing. I'm not saying, like, Derrida and Foucault came along and had these ideas and then communism declined. There's a lot of factors we're looking at. But I guess what's important to note is that, when it comes to, we were talking about neo-masculinists before, sort of the alt-right, or the ideas of someone like Peterson. When it comes to their adversaries, by the time of, the 90s, the 2000s, the 2010s, the main enemy in the Western world that was faced by the right, was not really Marxism, right? It's actually, at most we could say it's a sort of social democracy, social democratic approach. We're going to make sort of public programs and so forth more robust. We're going to enhance the rights of different minorities and so forth, right? At times it was, in many cases, it's not even social democratic. Look at someone like Biden, right? It's just, okay, you've got your standard kind of identity politics, and then you have a deep commitment to neoliberalism with one or two social programs attached. So I think what this kind of allows these people to do, right, by tracing this genealogy whereby Marxism has just been continued, right, and sort of it's the same idea just kind of transferred to the domain of identity politics or something. I think what this allows them to do is to sort of stoke this very, very strong reflex in our culture towards, in the Western cultures, towards the condemnation of communism, or to exploit that and to mobilize it against really a more liberal sort of opponent, right? So, at that point, I think there's a thing with Cathy Newman and Peterson, where Cathy Newman, she says, how can you compare Mao to a trans activist, right? And Peterson, he says, well, what's the difference? And she says, well, trans activists didn't kill millions of people. And Peterson basically says, well, the ideology that guides their utterances is the same, right? So you see kind of what's happening here, right? Now, I think I just want to add, I think what's interesting about that is that actually, to some extent, in the past few years, we have seen, a more far left that's become stronger. But that having been said, I still think that sort of the political and certainly economic force of this sort of neoliberal segment in our culture is much, much stronger than the far left. So I don't think that the far left is the real target. I think the game is to try to repurpose certain critiques that were traditionally wielded against the far left to great effect, and to blemish more liberal clusters of society, or paint them with that brush.
Yeah, I think this kind of, this conflation of Marxism with the identitarian left is quite telling. And actually, if we could understand how that happened, we could probably understand a bit more about the right, or the kind of like new right or alt-right. Because obviously they're not the same thing, but it seems to be that they're conflating the two because it's two ideologies that want to give people absolute sovereign power over their own bodies or something. That seems to be the thing that's most obvious because, I mean, in a way, actually, I would even argue that the greatest gains of the left have been made by feminists and sexual orientation rights advocates. Basically, people saying, you know, it's my body, I can do what I want with it, and that would include trans activists. But then that's what Marx was kind of saying. Obviously, not in the same way, but, you know, he was saying that the worker has a right to, you know, to control their own body and to make profit out of their own body. But those gains have been made much more by the identitarian left, and I would argue also race rights, civil rights movements in the last few decades than by the materialist left. So, you know, I can kind of see the link there in a way. And it's very interesting because it's almost like the right are seeing that link more than the left are. Yeah, well,
I just want to elaborate quickly. You know, I think in a way, like, even if you look at kind of what we call the old right, whatever that means, right? Let's say not the alt-right, right? Whatever, I mean, without elaborating too much. You know, people like, even people, you know, as odious as like George W. Bush or something like that, right? Ronald Reagan. You know, and certainly, you know, many, you know, American presidents prior to that, and so on. I think one thing is that there was a very, very strong, there were strong agendas against certain groups that were carried out, right? You know, and one of those historically with the older right was, you know, and Reagan's a good example here, was against communism, right? I mean, Reagan said, well, you know, the Soviet Union's an evil empire, right? Nothing equivocal about that, right? Very, very straightforward. And I think in a way, if you look at what the alt-right represents, I feel like in a way it represents a rejection of what the perceived tendency of certain establishment conservatives to seek compromise with some of these, you know, liberal movements that have been successful in strengthening the rights of certain groups, right? You know, always insofar as we're talking about liberalism, always in a context that's quite remote from the subject of class struggle, but nevertheless enhancing the rights of certain groups. So I think in a way it makes sense, like if you're trying to stage this kind of rebellion, you know, against, and so, you know, actually people in the alt-right will often use the term conservative, right, to talk about conservatives that, you know, are, you know, that love Israel, right, because the alt-right, a lot of them don't like Jews, that love Israel, that are open about, you know, mass Hispanic migration, that are amenable to certain subjects like gay rights. They'll call them conservatives, right? But so it makes sense to me that if you're trying to stage this kind of rebellion, that in a way you're going to try to legitimize yourself by adorning yourself kind of in the same, you know, sort of robes as past conservative movements that acquired more legitimacy. So I think trying to relate the opposition to these different, you know, social groups to, you know, communism can be an effective way to do that. But look, here's the risk, right? You know, if you look at the United States, it depends on the society. I mean, Italy's very different. But if you look at the United States, for example, the threat of communism was always very abstract because there were, you know, there were not really big, you know, self-described communist groups in the United States. If you look at what the alt-right's attempting to do, there are, you know, large numbers of people who identify with, you know, these groups that have been bestowed with these kind of rights by liberal movements. So I think that can be a lot more volatile, right, in a setting like the American, in a theater like the American theater, if you decide that that's what we're going to oppose.
Yeah, I have one last question, and I realize it might not be easy to answer, especially quickly. But at the end of that essay about the neo-masculinists, 2 pills, 1 cup, you also bring in a critique of consent culture. And I was wondering if you could briefly go over what that would be. But more importantly, like if you have a gesture for how a Marxist or materialist left might approach those same problems without getting trapped in that like legal framework.
Sure. Well, my critique in that is just that, in a way, like if you look at earlier kind of feminist thought, you know, whether we're talking about, you know, Charles Fourier or Luce Iragaray or whatever, there was a real attempt to kind of think about the way that society plays a really decisive role in shaping our desires, right? So what we desire might not be good. And you have quite, I was thinking about Fourier, right? The utopian socialist. You have some pretty radical programs that are envisioned, right? Fourier has the idea of paying both men and women, right, to basically be sort of like public servants, and their job is to go around and have sex with people to meet their needs. So he viewed sex as a kind of human right, in a way, and proposed a system for its sort of consensual addressal. But what I point out is basically, so you have this more maybe ambitious trajectory to early feminist thought, but since the 1980s, maybe Ellen Willis, you've had more and more of a tendency for all of these questions to be just subsumed under a very simplistic rubric of consent. Do you like that? Do you not like that? Right? And what's kind of lost here is the fact that, and you see this like in Tinder or something, right? It's just like, this is good, this is bad. Okay. And I think what can be lost there is really interrogating how our desires are shaped. And I think in a way, this is kind of part of the reason why neo-masculinists have success, because even if they have really, really ideological and sort of perverted views of how society functions, they do try to address the theme of sexuality within a social framework, right? It's a very, very chauvinistic social framework. It's a very wrong social framework, but it's still a social framework. And I think by contrast, all that the modern left can really do is just speak in this very, very transactional and kind of atomic, is this desired, is it not desired? So I think the real way that the left can get behind those get beyond those politics, like obviously I'm not saying like, consent's bad. That's not at all the point of what I wrote. The point of it would be to say that it's not sufficient, right? Because like we know in our society that, whether it's social class, whether it's race, whether it's, ableism, I mean, there's all kinds of things, right? That, Eurocentrism, obviously, that we privilege certain kinds of physical characteristics. Now, I'm not saying that can change tomorrow, right? But I do think that by trying to address a lot of the sort of, socioeconomic disparities, right? As well as disparities in representation that engender these kind of perceptions, that we can go further to not just having a society that assigns significance to the notion of consent, but in constructing a society that actually attempts to collectively, or a public, that collectively attempts to do more than that and actually address the underlying sort of prejudices that can inform that process of decision making.
Okay, yeah, I mean that's for sure complex, but we'll maybe have to leave people to kind of mull that over. But just thinking, just because there's so many issues we've addressed, aside from the issue of consent being complex, I just want to kind of leave it like that, because of course it's going to be to some extent controversial. But I agree that it's perhaps oversimplified in the kind of wider in the kind of general discourse. But we have so many issues we've covered today that all seem to be about power, but from very different angles. And there is kind of a kind of struggle of sorts. I mean, really, it feels very much, if you're talking online a lot with people from different countries, I mean, it depends really from where, but from a lot of Western countries, there's something of a battle going on. There is something of some kind of cultural kind of conflict going on. But it's going on, it's being fought on so many different levels at the moment. I mean, what would you say would be the desired outcome in the sense of, we've got an election coming up in America. I mean, that's in itself kind of a tricky one, because no one really wants, or no one on the left really wants Biden or Trump in. But, I think it would be nice to see the sitting president at least get removed, because that at least gives a sign that, that can happen. In the first term, at the end of the first term, but that's going to happen. It's going to play out either way, and we're going to be left in quite a similar position, because there are so many kind of ongoing conflicts that won't be resolved by Biden winning. Given that and the many other different things that are kind of playing out at the moment, what would you see as a kind of achievable, desirable outcome in the coming years, as we're not going to end up with full communism, for example. You know, what might we end up with that might feel like something of a move in the right direction?
Well, I think there's two possibilities, you know, and those are the two possibilities outlined by Marx in Capital, right? I mean, we get very embroiled in the question of reform versus revolution in Marx's work, but in a certain way, you know, it doesn't really matter. I mean, you know, I know that sounds crazy, but what I mean is that, you know, if you look at Marx's Capital, right, you know, he claims that, look, you know, because of automation and so forth, there's going to be a problem with profit rates. It's going to be harder for capitalists are going to make things. They're not going to find enough people to buy them, because you can put workers out of work, but you're still making goods and somebody has to buy those. I'm simplifying, but you understand. And that's really, you know, in many ways, that's the situation we're in now, isn't it? You know, we've got very, very effective firms, very effective, you know, automotive systems that we've developed. But we're more and more in a situation where there just isn't need for workers. You know, I think the most common job in America right now is a truck driver, right? There's like several million people who do this, right? You know, and now we have self-driving cars that are being created. So it's really not hard for one of those truck drivers, you know, or a couple of them, to just park their trucks along a major highway, just block all traffic. Marx's kind of point was that capitalism is faced sort of with two choices, right? And one is that, I mean, maybe more choices in this, but I'm reducing. Capitalism is kind of faced with two choices, and one of those choices is to, you know, redistribute wealth in such a thoroughgoing way that the contradictions that it's faced with, for instance, the realization of effective demand, are for the time being addressed, right? And that's what we've seen throughout history, right? That's how capitalism survived, right? You know, this was how sort of the crisis of automation and the Great Depression was resolved. It was resolved by creating, you know, massive public investment and creating all new kinds of new jobs, many of them, you know, bureaucratic and so forth, that couldn't be automated. And now we're kind of at a point, I think I would argue, the incapacity of society to American society, for example, to achieve the necessary forms of economic distribution that would allow them to address these issues, that it owes to the fact that now we're at a point where if you were to actually redistribute wealth to the level required to address the actual contradictions in capitalism, even with respect to underconsumption, you don't really have capitalism anymore, do you? I mean, is Roosevelt's New Deal society, you know, or the America of the 1950s, is that even consonant with what Marx meant when he called capitalism? Right? Because in the 19th century, we're talking like, you know, governments were absolutely minuscule compared to the mid-20th century. And now we're in an even worse situation, right, with automation, right? So, you know, we have a choice, right? Either we redistribute wealth in a very, very thoroughgoing way, right? And maybe that can save some semblance of capitalism at the cost of greatly transforming it, right? And depriving capitalists of a lot of the profits they imagine they might be able to earn otherwise. And maybe we won't be able to do that. And I think we have to seriously consider the possibility that we won't be able to do that, right? And if we don't do that, right? And we see with COVID, my God, you know, things are just going to get worse and worse in terms of public opposition, right? We talk about the Gilets jaunes or something like that. That's before COVID, right? I mean, I was here in Paris. I mean, if they didn't call in the military, people just would have went in and toppled Macron, toppled the Élysée, right? It was that close. So again, I see two possibilities. I see, you know, maybe some kind of, I don't know, Sanders-style coalition prevails in a few years, changes things really, really pervasively, and, you know, effectively protects capitalists in a way from a more dramatic kinds of social upheaval, if not liquidation. On the other hand, I think that if something like that doesn't happen, I think, you know, we're really looking at a ticking time bomb if things continue as they're going now, in terms of how long people who have been conditioned in a certain sense to have a certain living standard. I mean, look how successful the boomers were. People who were the children of the boomers, they saw that. People conditioned to enjoy a certain living standard, you know, subsequent generations being deprived of that. I think we're really looking at a ticking time bomb in terms of how long until there's going to be more mass and violent forms of revolt. And I'd be happy if we didn't need to do that. You know, I'd be happy if there was some kind of reformist solution that could, again, implement a sort of practical socialism, right? That hopefully could be used as a basis to transition further. But I don't know if it's going to happen, and I think we have to be prepared and ready to pick sides if that doesn't happen.
Okay, thank you. That's a sobering thought. And hey, I mean, maybe also the memes will get better if we have a revolution of that kind. I wonder what would happen to the memes. What kind of things will be going on online if that happens? But great to have you on, and you'll be welcome back. At some point soon, because there's so much more we could talk about.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll be following still your work with the Capital Comrades, and food for thought. So
yeah, thank you, Conrad. Are you gonna do volume 2 of Capital? You're done with volume 1 now, right?
I think we're about done. I think we're going to take a detour and look at some like Chinese, like socialism with Chinese characteristic stuff, just to try to get a better handle on that. And not many people discuss that, so it's kind of interesting. I mean, outside certain key texts by Mao. And then I think it'd be interesting, thinking of a longer term trajectory, I think it'd be interesting to do that and then to kind of move back and pick up in Capital after having examined some of the practical contexts in which some of these ideas are used or not used, as the case may be.